Good evening, everyone. Welcome, DTAC, to your 10th meeting. It's meeting number 10. And tonight, we have a pretty packed program, but we're really focusing on key topics that we want your input on as we consider drafting the downtown specific plan. So to just kind of kick us off, let's see. Here we go. The meeting is officially called to order, and if you all join me for the Pledge of Allegiance, that would be great. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now I'll take the DTAC roll call. Allie Board. Donna Lira. Here. Allison Cheng. Tom Davids. Anthony Kam. Here. Jean Denner. Robert Bollier. Amy Buckmaster. Madison Blanton. Here. Zuri Kadawar. Here. Dylan Carmen. I believe Dylan is going to be a few minutes late this evening. Sri Charan. Monette Meredith. Here. Joaquin Pedron.
Here.
James Bertram.
Here.
Cecile Lee. Tracy Massaro. And Elizabeth Min. Okay, great. We'll go ahead and get started. So for this evening, our primary discussion item for tonight will be to review some proposed parking and transportation demand management strategies for the downtown specific plan. So just a reminder, now that we've done a lot of work gathering all of the input and feedback, we are ready to adopt the Downtown Streetscape Master Plan. And now we switch our efforts towards the policy document, which is a specific plan. So what we will be discussing tonight will help inform the policies, strategies, regulations that will go into the downtown specific plan. So before we get started, I just wanted to just pause briefly and share with you how we go about establishing new policies and regulations and what we look to in service of developing our priorities. What are our priorities? What are our shared values with respect to parking, with respect to circulation, access, active transportation, really creating a pedestrian-friendly city and downtown? The first thing that we do is we look at our general plan. And when our general plan was adopted back in 2009, it set in course a series of actions that the city would consider as part of its decision-making process over the course of future years. Fast forward to today. And back then, we had actions that would, where the city would commit to a continuous review of its downtown parking standards, and that the city would amend these parking standards as necessary in order to support a pedestrian-oriented environment, while minimizing parking impacts on adjacent neighborhoods. The city also committed to evaluating options that would increase safe and convenient bicycle access and parking in the downtown area. So fast forward to today, we're working on a reset to our 2030 general plan that was adopted in 2009. And that reset would really take the general plan to the year 2045. And as part of that process, we're keeping the policies, the action items that I just presented, but also adding to that. We're kind of being more intentional about how do we get to this great pedestrian-oriented environment, reducing impacts to neighborhoods and things like that. So one of the policies out of that 2045 general plan reset aims to reduce traffic by implementing and enforcing what is referred to as transportation demand management strategies. And we'll get into those, but we want to be very intentional about really working towards reducing that traffic. An additional policy also points to some newly adopted transportation study guidelines, and this is a methodology that the city has adopted in order to evaluate traffic. And those guidelines really point to transportation demand management strategies as the number one thing to really address traffic. And what we've heard from our consultants and hear from those in the field regarding TDM strategies is that the best TDM strategy is actually effective parking management. So we're going to talk a lot this evening about parking management. In addition to the general plan, we also have, gleaned a lot from the community, all of your input here at DTAC meetings, and also from the community to create a downtown vision. I know you've seen this before, but in the downtown vision, it points to creating a pedestrian-friendly, safe, and charming, accessible destination for the downtown, and that downtown would be an inclusive place with easy access for all. So parking and TDM really start to get towards those objectives. And then again, with our downtown guiding principles, with respect to mobility and connectivity, we are working towards policies and goals and implementation that really drive home this downtown mobility and connectivity principle, which is that downtown should have a balance of mobility modes that emphasizes pedestrian, bicycle, and public transit circulation, along with effective parking management strategies to support a socially vibrant, pedestrian-oriented environment and minimize auto dependence to access downtown. And in addition, I just have a couple more slides before we get into the heart of our meeting. One of the draft goals that we're preparing as part of the downtown specific plan focuses on multimodal transportation, active meaning walking, biking, etc., a place that is safe, accessible, with good connectivity to foster that pedestrian-friendly, vibrant downtown that we're looking for. And then finally, another goal for the downtown specific plan focusing on parking and TDM is to work towards a goal of setting forth parking management strategies that efficiently address parking needs and reduce car dependency through innovative TDM strategies. During the course of the presentation, we're going to be taking pauses in between the information that is shared, and this will be a pause to kind of reflect back on what was just presented, see if you have any questions or whatever comments or feedback you'd like to give. So we're going to start first with parking management strategies, and then we'll conclude with some transportation demand management strategies that we're looking ahead, and then we'll wrap up the meeting with next steps. In the meantime, feel free to help yourself with some drinks and food. Feel free to get up. And now I would like to hand over the presentation to Brian Canepa with W-Trans.
Thanks. Thank you, Lisa. Pleasure to be here with you all tonight. As Lisa said, I am Brian Canepa from W-Trans, a principal planner out of our Santa Rosa office. And I'm happy to be here. Hopefully some of you maybe remember me from the All Commissions meeting last year. And as Lisa said, we're going to be talking about quite a bit of information tonight. So we will be making frequent pauses to ask questions, to discuss things. Again, don't be bashful. Stand up, stretch, move around if you're getting a little stiff here, because I appreciate your time here tonight. So Lisa already covered the general plan and other policies and actions associated with this work that we're doing here. But just stepping back for a second about why we're doing this more from a practical standpoint is important. So from the parking management side of things, really what we're ultimately trying to do is come up with a system that can better manage your on and off-street parking as well as your public and private. And by better manage, I mean working to make sure that you have adequate availability for when people want to find parking spaces, making sure that there's proper turnover for businesses, that they really rely on that for the success of their bottom line, and also looking to make sure that, for example, spillover doesn't become a problem in residential neighborhoods and things of that sort. Ultimately, the plan that we're putting together is really intended to serve all users, whether they be residents and they're concerned about spillover, or visitors who, for example, want to stay longer in downtown and really help businesses thrive. Now, we're talking not only about current development as part of our work here, but we're also looking to the future, understanding that there's a relatively new general plan in effect going out to 2045, and there is a considerable amount of development that is associated with that, both residential and commercial. So we want to be very intentional about how we go about this, understanding that demand might look one way today, but that over time, in 10, 20 years, things could look different, and we want to be able to prepare for that. Just as a reminder, for those of you who don't follow regional policy and state law as much, for the past couple of years now, AB 2097 has been in effect for the entire state of California. Places that are within half a mile of a major transit stop, such as downtown here, no longer have any minimum parking requirements associated with it. Very few, I should say. In addition, MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, has adopted a transit-oriented communities policy that is pushing communities, encouraging them to adopt parking maximums, which we'll talk about soon. The reason why I bring this up is because I want to set the stage for some of these parking strategies that we're about to discuss, because, as I like to say, there's been a paradigm shift in how parking is supplied and managed. Previously, for most of the 20th century, new uses were assumed to provide their own parking, and they could kind of take care of their own demand. That is long gone now. Most new uses that are built or introduced to the downtown will not be required to provide parking per state law. And so it behooves us now to be able to look at steps that might need to be taken both currently and in the future to better manage demand as it grows over time, so it doesn't necessarily, so new development doesn't come at the expense of existing businesses and existing residents. As part of what we're looking at is not only vehicles, though, we're also taking into account multimodal transportation, particularly bicycles and two-wheel transportation, as well as incentivizing pedestrian movement throughout the downtown. So we'll be looking at bicycle requirements that come along with it, making sure that particularly new development has sufficient bike capacity, and frankly, just better bicycle connectivity within the downtown. So, moving on. Just a brief overview again on the existing conditions. And these are, I apologize, you probably have already seen this data before. I think we discussed some of it during our all commissions meeting last year, but I just want to refresh just for everyone's memory because I'm sure you all remember vividly my slides from that point. But in order to inform this study, we actually conducted occupancy and inventory surveys of the entire downtown. Again, that's on-street, off-street parking, public, and private, because you really need a comprehensive look at how the parking system as a whole functions. And we did this over a few different days. It was a Thursday, a Saturday, and a Sunday. And we did it essentially from morning till night. And we even looked late at night because we were curious to see if there were spillover issues into the adjoining neighborhood. In total, we looked at almost 3,100 spaces. And just really touching on the highlights here, what we found was, the peak demand for the entire downtown happened at noon on a Thursday, between noon and 1 p.m., when about roughly 60% of the spaces were occupied overall. Now, that gives a bit of a distorted view because on some blocks, they were fully occupied. On other blocks, there was lots of available spaces, which is not uncommon in downtowns. You have, obviously, people will tend to gravitate, for example, wanting to park on Laurel and maybe not park on Elm Street as much. Other places have very low occupancy. The Caltrain lot, as some of you are probably aware, not many cars parked there, particularly in this post-pandemic world. The peak occupancy of that lot only reached 20%. So there's a significant opportunity there to better utilize those spaces. We also we wanted to make sure that we were capturing special events, looked at Farmers Market Sunday to see how that operates. That's different, obviously. On-street spaces are packed on the Farmers Market Sunday, right? 80% if you look at the entire north downtown, essentially north downtown being north of Arroyo. So these levels, I say the 60%, but this varies significantly based on location and based on time of day and day of week. So what we just kind of deciphered from the data at the end of the day is that, as I mentioned, it can be difficult to find parking in certain parts of the downtown currently, depending on where you're trying to park, right? Everyone's trying to go to the most, curb, the prime spaces near their businesses, generally speaking. But that there is a substantial amount of parking out there that is vacant, even at peak hour. So looking at the Wheeler Garage, for example, particularly the second floor of the Wheeler Garage, Walnut Street, Elm Street, and certain private lots. I will note, too, that we did, as part of our data collection, look at how long vehicles were staying in particular areas, because we need to figure out, or it's good to figure out, whether vehicles are staying past the time limits. If employees, in particular, are taking advantage of on-street spaces, either rotating through spaces or exceeding time limits. And we found that while adherence to time limits is generally good, there were a fair number of vehicles out there that were staying many hours at a time, which is partially, or rotating spaces, which is a function both of time limits and enforcement. And the last thing I will touch on here as part of our, quote, existing conditions, because it is something that we're taking into account here and kind of assuming is built into this, is the streetscape master plan that is part of the downtown specific plan. So as part of the streetscape master plan, there's some changes that are being proposed, and hopefully some of you have seen the hearings that have happened recently. We had a planning commission last week discussing some of this. But through some of the changes, there would be, or planned to be, a removal of 47 on-street parking spaces, as you can see here on the slides, on El Camino and Laurel. These 47 spaces would be removed for on-street, for more on-street dining, wider sidewalks, bicycle parking, other amenities as well. When we conducted our data collection, we wanted to also verify at that time, if you were going to remove these spaces, is there adequate availability right now to be able to accommodate that demand? And what we found was, at that time, there were 73 empty on-street spaces within a block of there, and 144 empty spaces in the Wheeler Garage. There is sufficient parking nearby to be able to kind of manage that. In addition, as part of the streetscape master plan, there is a planned reorganization of some of the alleys. I'll use my pointer here. Hopefully you can see it. On the east side of Laurel. Right now, some of the lots are very much divided and fragmented into different private spaces. And we know from really good parking management that the more spaces you make shared and publicly accessible, they become much more efficient. And so part of what the downtown streetscape plan is going to look at is to be able to kind of mimic the way that the lot behind the Bank of America operates, essentially. Shared pool where you can really maximize the efficiency of those spaces, right? That benefits everyone. I was alluding to this earlier with staff, but it's like a shopping mall. You wouldn't expect a shopping mall to have dedicated parking for each individual business because it doesn't function as well. And so specifics need to still be hashed out about that, but that would be kind of the preferred approach at this point. I'm going to pause there. This will be the first of our pauses, but I figure we've kind of spoken enough. I know this is a lot of introductory existing conditions languages, but I want to open it up to any questions or comments at this point about anything we've covered, whether it has to do with the data, whether it has to do with any of the laws I discussed, anything having to do with the general plan or policies that Lisa brought up.
Quick question.
Yes.
Caltrain parking at 20%?
Yes.
Is that due because they charge you to park there?
Yeah, well, I will say this, I should have mentioned this before. Most transit agencies in the pandemic and after pandemic have suffered a severe decline in ridership, and they are increasing. They would like to get back to where they were before, but even pre-pandemic, I believe their peak occupancy in the lot was maybe 50%. So they just simply didn't have the number of people parking there. Currently, there is a shared parking agreement in place on the southern end of that lot for people to use, but frankly, there's still a lot of empty spaces, and we're starting conversations with Caltrain and Samtrans to open those lots to make them more available to the public more of the time. Yes, Donna.
I think the last time you presented this, we were working on many aspects of the design, and maybe when you guys do your survey, maybe I can shadow you at some flex on Elm Street at certain parts of the day, but ultimately it's pushing employees to park on Elm at certain points. At certain points it's so crowded, it's impossible to pass 2 cars at a time over there. And there's a lot of spillover into residential streets from Caltrains for airport parking for them, for people to catch for the weekend and park on residential streets. So I think that, some of these more open public spaces are not being utilized, but residential streets are definitely being utilized by employees and by downtown people, patrons, and also by travelers, on one mechanism or another for daily work or for airport travel.
And no, thank you for that comment. And that doesn't surprise me, considering how parking is managed right now. One of the strategies that we will be talking about is prioritizing residential parking for residents in the downtown area and trying to get employees. Right now, there's a strong incentive, kind of a unintentional incentive for employees to park in residential neighborhoods because it's largely unregulated. And so we're trying to switch some of the regulations here so that doesn't happen. But I can completely understand that is happening to a certain degree. Okay, all right, well, we'll keep rolling then. So now we're going to get into the meat of this here. So strategy. So what are we actually proposing at this point? I'm going to pause here for a second to say the strategies is not just a big bucket of strategies that are all going to be implemented or recommended to be implemented at once. The intent here is to phase strategies over time, with short-term strategies, for example, being relatively lower cost, easier to implement measures, things that you can do quickly, and measure not whether they have an impact before proceeding to other strategies, right? So starting up with that, first measure up is simply just modifying how parking is managed from a time perspective. So one of the things that we noticed, in the city, I should actually note this too, because there were questions after the last all commissions meeting about, is the Wheeler garage really that empty? The city actually did go out and re-inventoried it, I think, a couple times and found that their numbers more or less corroborated what we had seen, which is that the second floor of the Wheeler garage in particular at almost all hours is largely empty. And so this is due to maybe the fact that it's not as visible, also because there's employee permits up there. One of our recommendations as part of this plan, because the employee permit program in downtown is really not well utilized. I think to your point you just made, why bother participating in an employee permit program if I can simply go park 2 blocks away and from someone's house, and that would be much easier. So the idea behind this, one of the measures that we're recommending is basically for that second floor of the Wheeler garage, just make it free 10-hour parking. Don't charge employees to park up there, just get it utilized. Right now, you have a garage that was surely expensive to build, and you really want to see it better utilized and get employees in particular, people who are parking for many hours at a time, using those spaces. For the time being, that might mean that people don't pay for downtown employee permits as much. Frankly, that program is not really well utilized right now anyways. It's good to maintain, but still use it more frequently when there's actually a different parking situation. Second is to change the hours of what I call the hours of operation for when your on-street time limits are in effect. Traditionally, a lot of cities have had their time limits go from, essentially what you see here, roughly 7 a.m. in the morning, sometimes 8, to when business is traditionally closed, which is 5 or 6 p.m. The reality is that most downtowns, particularly in the past 10, 20 years, have shifted from having the local hardware store and simple retail to having more what they call experiential downtowns. People are not just coming to buy something, they're coming to have a coffee, they're coming to have a restaurant, they're going to have drinks. And because of that, activity has shifted in many downtowns later at night. But the time limits haven't really, or the hours of operation haven't kept pace with it. And the problem this creates is that, for example, if I'm an employee coming downtown and I have an evening shift at a restaurant, I can park at 4 p.m. right on Laurel Street and leave my car there. And this poses a problem in terms of who is occupying those prime spaces. Relatively simple change to make. Simply update the times from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. and frankly, have it take place on Sundays too, when frankly there is still a sufficient amount of parking demand to warrant time limits. And potentially shift the morning hours from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. Again, we didn't collect data during that time, but we would encourage the city to look at that. Second is looking at a transportation management association. Let me just clarify for those of you at home or people here about what Transportation Management Association is. It essentially is a body that is normally, or an entity that is comprised of normally public-private partnership. And it's a group of mostly businesses who band together to be able to manage transportation resources and expenditures within a particular district. The reason for doing so is so that they can really maximize their resources to be able to deploy strategies effectively. I, as an individual business owner, maybe might not be able to have a shuttle system, for example, but if we all banded together, that might be possible. The city, and the reason why I bring this up is the city is already underway developing a Transportation Management Association as part of the Alexandria District. That TMA is intended to be broadened over time to be a citywide TMA, inclusive of the downtown, so that, for example, a shuttle system would access the downtown as well as other uses, maybe across the rail tracks, that employees might receive free or subsidized transit passes to come to work. The Palo Alto TMA does that. There are many TMAs that operate around the Bay Area very successfully, and they range substantially in terms of the levels of services they offer. What this TMA looks like over time is a little undecided. Again, that's already being set up as part of the Alexandria District, but we did want to recognize it as part of the work that we're doing here. The third is looking at just simple information, frankly. A lot of times, people might not be able to find parking resources or use different mobility options because they just don't know they're out there. Wayfinding is a great way to do it, and always match it up with whatever it is you're changing. If we're going to say the second floor of the Wheeler Garage, for example, is essentially all-day free parking, you better point people to it because they're going to love that. If you have, I'll get to in a second, but if you do have private spaces that are shared with the public, even during certain hours, let them know that. Pointing people both in terms of signs and online is a great way to shift parking demand. Right now, the online mobility information offered by the city is good, but it could be improved. There are other cities out there that do a really good job. We have Walnut Creek right here on the screen. I personally like their website. But they have a lot of good information out there to be able to get people to where they should or could be parking before they even arrive in downtown. And it also you can pair that with really good resources for downtown employees, for example, showing them commuting resources, linking them to guides like commute.org, other regional agencies about information they might not know exist. And trust me, doing work in different jurisdictions within the Bay Area, oftentimes there's a significant number of free regional resources that are available to employees that many employees are just simply not aware of. Shared parking agreements. Excuse me. So define shared parking agreements just real briefly is when two or more entities either agree to share the lots that they have or parking spaces, or to make spaces publicly accessible during all or some of their hours. And so I mentioned, for example, Caltrain. Caltrain is a great opportunity to work with them. They've signaled an openness to have more of their spaces be publicly accessible because they're not used well right now. Realistically, those spaces would probably be best used by long-term parkers like employees. We understand that crossing El Camino Real can be a bit of a treacherous walk sometimes. So as part of the downtown specific plan, we're looking at safer crossings for that. But also looking at shared parking agreements with private lot owners as well. And I should say willing private lot owners. This is not mandatory. This is completely optional. But shared parking agreements have become much more prevalent in certain jurisdictions. I happen to do a lot of work in Sacramento, and they actually have quite a few of these in effect. But to work with private lot owners who have empty spaces, maybe even just after hours, maybe it's after 5 p.m. when the business shuts down, and being able to have an actual written agreement with that business such that those spaces are available to the public, understanding that liability has to be covered, compensation, and other factors such as that. The reason why these are effective is because we both maximize existing resources that are already out there and built, and it's much, much cheaper than trying to build new parking. Nothing frustrates me more personally than driving around at night and seeing 50 empty spaces I simply can't park in because it's, used for a bank or whatever the case happens to be. And as part of our work here, you can see we went through the data and actually identified some potential lots that could be a part of this part of the system. One of the things that we've heard repeatedly, I think, through the different meetings that we've been holding and hearings is enforcement. Yes, this is all great. Enforcement is a problem, not only in the downtown, but just kind of generally citywide, and that the current arrangement with the sheriff's office is not optimal, that people are not routinely enforcing, that it's much more of a complaint-driven process, and there's a real need to shift. Because frankly, you can change all the regulations you want. If people know there's no enforcement, it probably won't change behavior as much. Part of our recommendation is to switch from the current arrangement through the sheriff's office to one of two models. One is to pull it entirely in-house through what we call CSOs, community service officers, who are not quite police, but people who have the authority to monitor parking, or a third-party vendor. Some other communities on the peninsula here use third-party vendors to monitor and ticket and handle those duties. Regardless of how it's done, we would recommend obviously the most technologically advanced way of doing it. So that's why we show vehicles like this with automated license plate recognition software, so that any sort of enforcement can be done quickly. But the purpose of this ultimately is really to ensure compliance. It's not to be punitive, but it's to make sure, for example, you don't have certain employees who are parking 10 hours at a time in front of your favorite business. And lastly, on the short-term strategies, is looking at how new development parks itself. And this is, just bear with me for a second, because it's a little bit awkward here. We wanted to put this in the short-term strategies because we want to realize that new development could happen at any time. 100-unit apartment complex gets built. I'm just making up a number here. If an apartment complex gets built in the next few years. Right now, by law, those apartments are not necessarily required to provide any parking. I've seen in other jurisdictions where developers will say, great, I don't need to provide as much parking. I'm going to just assume all those people park on street. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Part of what we're trying to do here is make sure that new development doesn't come online at the expense of the existing community. We don't want a situation where developers feel like they can come in and have their tenants or patrons all park on streets, whether they be on the business streets or residential streets. Currently, the city has a residential parking permit program for residential districts. It's only in effect in Greater East San Carlos. You'll see in our midterm strategies that we're recommending that be applied citywide if people want it. But we would say that any residential permits moving forward not be either not be applicable or eligible for new developments like this, so that you don't have, for example, that 100 apartment complex come in and everyone suddenly buys residential permits to park on street, or two, to actually charge those developments market rate. This is actually a program I mentioned where I work in Sacramento. They're actually rolled this out now for, I think, 4 different developments and said, if you want to park on street, great, but it's not free. It's $260 a month to park on street here. And people actually will choose either to pay for it or not. But the purpose of it is to minimize the impacts and make sure that the on-street parking is not essentially the primary location for new development to come and use.
Hey, Brian, just a quick question.
Yep.
Developers have no responsibility to have good parking. However, they use the bill.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have that requirement for commercial, right?
No.
Really?
No. So just to re-clarify, AB 2097, the law says that within half a mile of a major transit stop, which includes, I should clarify this, existing or future major transit stop. So it basically means a half mile within El Camino Real, because it's both the high-speed bus lines that are planned as well as the train station. Any uses within those areas are not required to provide parking. The only ones that are required to provide a minimum amount of parking right now by law are hotels. For some reason, there was a carve-out made for that. There is an appeals process to try to get around that. It requires a substantial amount of evidence to prove otherwise. I will note, most developments, particularly market rate developments, will provide parking. Just hands down, they will. You're not going to build a $2 million condo here and have no parking associated with it. It just won't sell. But people might provide less parking, and we want to be cognizant that this also applies to commercial uses as well. Again, if a retail establishment came in, maybe they don't provide new parking. If an office use comes in, maybe they will. It might vary. And so part of our work that we're doing with the city is we're actually looking at actual parking supply from developments that have been built in the past 5 years. So we've collected all the data from all the parking that was supplied by recent developments and analyzed that as well. Did you have an additional question?
Yeah, that was it.
Okay. Yep, that's the law. Well, this is actually a perfect spot because we are at our pause moment, so I will pause. We just covered quite a few short-term strategies. Again, this is not all the strategies, just the initial set that we're proposing. Again, they are relatively easier to implement. You're not talking about major infrastructure improvements or anything costly.
How is the TMA paid for?
So the TMA initially would be paid for, that's still being hashed out by the city. I'm not part of those negotiations necessarily, but this TMA initially I think will be the responsibility of the Alexandria project that's getting it up and running. TMAs over time tend to be financed through dues by their member businesses and organizations. Those dues can vary significantly based on what the TMA provides. I've seen there are some TMAs within the state that just simply provide information to employees, and it costs virtually nothing, and their dues are extremely low. You have the Emeryville TMA, which operates a shuttle system that's constantly running. Same thing in Mountain View. The dues are higher because you're actually operating your own transit system effectively. So what that looks like is completely still up in the air. Any other questions? No? That's okay. All right. All right, I'll move my pages around here. Okay, now we're getting into the midterm strategies here. All right. So first, the midterm strategy is relatively basic, working on more bicycle infrastructure in the downtown. Part of the downtown specific plan is looking at, obviously, it's already been voted on to permanently close the 700 block of Laurel, turn that into a public plaza, and to also change the configurations of the 600 and 800 blocks of Laurel. Part of this is, and also in San Carlos, I should say, part of this is really to encourage multimodal access, and building bicycle parking hubs is a great way to bring people as close as possible to the heart of your downtown, right? So bicyclists in particular will always want to park as close as possible. Sometimes they don't hesitate to park illegally and just tie their bike to a tree or wherever the case happens to be. Understanding that the 700 block is intended to be a dismount zone, right? So there is that caveat kind of built into it too. But the idea is that for relatively little cost and relatively little space occupied, you actually can have some pretty quality bicycle parking available with things like basic repair stations, so people can, pump up their tire if they need to. They can do basic things like that. Yes, and so these are just some examples. We're not recommending any particular one at this point, but there's a variety to choose from at the end of the day. Next up, public parking pricing. Public parking pricing. This is, I would say, one of the best ways to manage parking demand. And by parking demand, I mean the availability and turnover of spaces. Again, going back to this idea of businesses really relying on turnover to thrive in their business. But, and this is a big but, you only price parking if it's absolutely needed. And by absolutely needed, I mean when the demand actually warrants it. So if you have a block and you have 6 spaces occupied on it, you don't want to price, right? That's too few cars to price it. When the occupancy exceeds a certain threshold and it becomes actually difficult to find spots and you have problems with people staying too long, you don't have that turnover, that's the point in which you actually want to explore this option. We've couched this as a midterm strategy, but really the implementation of it would only take effect once a certain threshold was hit. So it's not to say, in 2 years, go ahead and do this. We intentionally put all the short-term strategies first because we believe that a lot of those strategies will actually mitigate some of the on-street congestion that you're currently seeing. And this might not happen for a while. But we also want to be cognizant that there is new development slated for the downtown. There will be more cars parking here, inevitably. And we want to be better prepared for that. And when I mean thresholds in terms of when do you actually price parking is, what we're recommending here is to say, when occupancy basically consistently hits over 70% on particular blocks for extended periods, then it makes sense to explore parking pricing only in non-residential areas, right? So this is not on residential streets, this is only on non-residential streets. To boot, you want to be able to structure it in a way that you don't discourage people from staying longer. Right now, the 2-hour time limit structure that you have in place works okay, considering the amount of development that's here. The problems with it is that either A, after 2 hours, people feel compelled to leave, or B, they tend to shuffle their cars, whether they be a visitor or an employee. You'll see a lot of this with employee parking. We've actually done some pretty interesting analyses looking at employee license plates simply shifting from safe space to try to stay in compliance. It creates problems. So the idea, what we would recommend if any pricing program did occur, don't have time limits. You simply price it to encourage turnover at the end of the day. And also set your time limits in your pricing to encourage people to stay longer in off-street lots. You actually see this in Redwood City right now, for example. In some of their off-street lots, they have free parking for the first 2 hours, and then it's only priced after that. And then if you want to park on-street, maybe it's 50 cents or $1 an hour, something along those lines. At the end of the day, though, what's really critical about any pricing program is to make sure that any revenues that you generate in that area stay within the district. It doesn't go to the general fund, it goes back to whatever district actually generated it. I'll get in more detail into that in a second, but I did want to mention that. In addition, you don't just price and just let it go. You actually monitor it and adjust it over time. I mentioned Redwood City. They have a long history of working with this, as well as other communities, but Redwood City is, I think, kind of ahead of the pack, frankly. They have a system similar to Seattle, Washington. I just pulled Seattle, Washington graphics because they're very visual. They actually monitor and adjust hours, and it's actually set by code so that if occupancy falls and it's too low, the prices go down. If occupancy goes up, the prices can go up too. At the end of the day, though, that there are caps, price caps inserted. Understandably, when I talk to people about parking pricing in the Bay Area, they say, I went into San Francisco and it was $15 an hour. Yeah, that can really startle some people. And so by code, and as they did in Redwood City, you actually can set a price cap and say it will not exceed this amount to make sure that the prices don't get out of hand. In addition to this, there are options that can be folded into parking pricing, such as residential permits. There are some communities in California, one in the North Bay, that offer permits to residents who are of the city to park for free in parking meters, so that the parking meters or the parking pricing is really directed at visitors rather than residents of the city. So there are ways to change this and manipulate it so that it really works for you. As I mentioned, these would go into what we call a parking benefit district. Again, just to elaborate a little bit more on this, is that these are districts where essentially you have some entity or committee, it could be a DTAC, it could be another body, who basically decide how those revenues are spent within the city. It could be more parking, it could be better bicycle parking, it could be street improvements, it could be whatever it happens to be. You see one of the best PBDs that's actually derived success is actually down in Pasadena. Old Pasadena years ago was in a real funk. I mean, it was pretty hard down economically speaking. They actually introduced meters because they were having so many problems with employees parking on street and essentially taking up spaces that were really intended for businesses. And they actually helped really refine this parking benefit district process, and they actually have substantial revenues coming into the downtown to help fund that. I will note, parking and managing parking is not about revenue generation. Some people have asked me before, well, parking pricing, I went to this location and it was horrible. And I said, yes, you're absolutely right, because they use parking pricing as a way to get money, not to manage demand. And if you do that, then you can absolutely damage your businesses. If you use parking as simply a way to get money rather than basing your prices on demand, that will be problematic. And so you have to be very careful in being able to use these things. Fortunately, there are many communities who have deployed it very successfully. In addition to this, I talk about the residential permit programs I referred to earlier. The city currently has in its code an RPP process set up for the greater East San Carlos, but it's really restricted to that area. Our recommendation is to be able to essentially expand that to anywhere in the city. And it could be either city or citizen initiated, but ultimately it comes down to a vote of the residents in that area. They have to vote to actually want a residential parking permit in their district, such that they would get permits to be able to park on street whenever they wanted to, and visitors outside of it may only be able to park, for example, 2 hours during the day. We are recommending, at this point, some changes to the RPP program, at least the way it's structured with the GESC, to limit the number of household permits to 4. Currently it's 6. Having too many permits actually causes problems because people tend to park their vehicles on street. And also to set up a system that's based on cost recovery, so that right now the permit system for the GESC comes entirely at the city's expense. And most residential parking permit programs in the country, particularly successful ones, price it at something. It can be a base amount or some small amount. There's been some discussions with the GESC folks about who would pay those prices. But at the end of the day, we're looking at prices probably something along the lines of $25 a year, $50 a year. Palo Alto has RPPs in effect, and they are $51 a year for an annual permit. Again, totally optional. Districts don't have to sign up for this if they don't want to, but it is an option to get at some of the issues that were raised earlier about employees and parking in front of homes. And again, I will note that new multifamily or multi-unit development would not be eligible for this. So you can't expect, I think to the question earlier, if an affordable housing development came and provided a lot less parking, the residents there couldn't have they couldn't rely on RPPs to park on street for cheap rather than parking in their building or somewhere else. But in this way, the idea is to really prioritize the resident needs where it's appropriate. It might not be appropriate in certain parts of the city, but downtown very well may be one of those areas that wants to explore it. I'll hit long-term strategies very quickly, and then we'll stop for questions. There's really only one long-term strategy here, and it's really kind of half and half. It has to do with vehicle valet parking and bicycle valet parking. Bicycle valet parking could probably be actually deployed a little earlier. Bicycle coalitions around the Bay Area, oftentimes for special events, for relatively minimal cost, will have safe and secure parking for attendees to come. And you can come to the special event, your bicycle is safe, they monitor it by staff, and normally it's kind of part of the festival anyways that they do it. Vehicle valet parking can be a little bit more complicated, but there's a lot of private vendors out there who can do it successfully. And again, it would really mainly be for special events, but it's a great way to be able to fit a lot of cars into lots that don't have as many spaces. So essentially taking a lot that normally has 100 spaces and you're able to fit, for example, 150 vehicles in it. Again, that's something that we'd look at further down the line, but there's definitely opportunities for it using the Wheeler Garage, looking at the Caltrain lot, and so forth. Now I will pause. Okay, that was a mouthful. And so I'll pause on discuss questions on any of those strategies, midterm or the one long term. Yes?
First of all, I just want to point out there was no discussion about handicap parking. Something more than enough for tonight's topics, but there's barns in between currently, and you know, it's a lot of unusual parking going on with them. There's one handicap parking down the 700 block as you come out of the bank that's facing the direction that you're not supposed to be driving on. The other day, I did see someone turn their vehicle around, like, you know, going in the wrong direction of that street. It's a one-way at this point. So handicap parking wasn't really discussed, and maybe that's for another time. But when it comes to this residential parking, these special parking permits in neighborhoods, I mean, it sounds like the community as a whole has to go for that. You know, there was a survey done by the city a long time ago, and they realized that some of us as households, true houses, not multi-dwellings, apartment buildings, do not have garages, perhaps, or garages big enough for our vehicles. And there was, you know, certain way that things were handled around that parking, and you know, the police department actually in the city actually noted who those residents were, including me as one of them. So, you know, when you talk about paying for these permits, I mean, I pay my taxes on my house, and I'm a resident. I've been there a long time, and now you're asking me to pay for parking permits on top of it. And it's difficult when the city recognizes you're a two-car resident and you don't have a garage, but you have a driveway, and you can get one off-street and one on-street, and the allowance that the city and the police department has allowed for, and kind of hear this discussion tonight, you know, it's kind of difficult to hear how this is being proposed for the future.
Sure. Can I respond to these, because these are excellent comments? I don't mean to interrupt you. You might have more, but I figured I might just take these in turn. I apologize. There's actually more strategies after this that are not necessarily short, mid, or long-term strategies. They have particularly to do with the zoning code. And in that, we have a whole section related to ADA and accessible parking. So I will get to that in a second. So I apologize. I understand it's kind of confusing how it's laid out. We wanted to set the zoning strategies aside on the side. Two, related to the RPP, it's actually an excellent point that you make, that not all houses are built equally, right? And people could look at a house with no garage and somehow be treated equally in an RPP as a house with 4 parking spaces, or four-space garage, I should say. There are RPPs in the country, Arlington, Virginia being one of them. They probably have one of the oldest and best RPP programs, where they actually have variable pricing based on the size of your garage. If you have no garage, it's a free RPP permit then to park on street. If you have one car, whatever the case happens to be, it's staged such that the tiers of pricing are such that you are more strongly discouraging people who have multiple garages off street from parking on street, not people who have no garages, because then you're more or less kind of compelled to park on street. So that is an excellent point and something that we do want to consider as part of this. So thank you for raising that. I'm sorry, did you have other questions?
That's okay, I'll wait. Yeah, no problem. I'd like to hear more.
Other questions?
Well, St. Carlos has always prided itself on being one of the few cities that does not have paid parking meters and whatever. And I know that's been something that people in this town have always valued and really liked. So that was number one. And second of all, like this downtown area is such a mix of single homes and multi-dwellings, and now more and more, as those older homes are sold, they get sold to something that then builds a condo unit or whatever. So the area is just really mixed, which makes it seem hard to me that if they're building new, that those people wouldn't be required. You know, the parking doesn't affect, they don't have to, you know, accommodate the parking, except I maybe having street parking impacting the other people who live on the block that have houses.
So can I take your comments in reverse order?
Yeah.
So just to clarify on the second comment, you're saying a new multi-unit development that comes in, it seems strange that they don't have to provide parking?
Isn't that, you said that the new developments don't have to provide?
They don't, and theoretically they don't. By law, they don't. And so what we're proposing as part of this then, well, pause for a second, to go back again, even though they don't have to, they will. Vast majority of them will. Looking at parking data that we picked up from both affordable and market rate units within the city of San Carlos, we found that right now market rate units on average provide about 0.75 spaces per bedroom. Just that's what they want to provide. Affordable provides closer to about 0.5. I think it's 0.48. So generally speaking, they will provide some parking. It would be hard to market some of these things without having some parking. That said, they might provide, some might provide more and some might provide less. And part of what we're trying to anticipate here is that, yes, there might be some developments that come in and provide little to no parking. And I say this because I've seen it happen already in other communities. It's not a bad thing for them to provide less parking. There could be people with fewer cars. But we need to be ready to be able to handle the mobility needs of those residents. And we don't want a situation, or we're trying to prevent a situation that basically you have massive spillover onto the street. But again, that's part of the legal framework we're working in. Sorry, just one last question too on the parking pricing piece. I fully understand this community right now has no parking pricing, and that the discussion around this would be very difficult and requires a lot of discussion. Fully understand that. I also want everyone here to walk into this with open eyes. If you have new development and you have more cars parking on the street and more congestion, if you do not have parking pricing, which is probably your most effective tool for managing demand, you will very likely have problems. That's okay. You don't have to do parking pricing. The city council very well may not opt for that. But everyone should understand walking into this what the trade-offs are. Right now it works well, and I don't think in the short term it's going to be a problem. I think we're coming up with strategies that kind of resolve this without the need for it. But there does come a point where, and we've seen significant development east of the railroad tracks, and we've been looking at the general plan build-outs for downtown. There's a significant amount of downtown development slated. And we're just trying to set the policies in place right now that if and when you need it, it's there. But I hear what you're saying.
And one last thing. I know the state's been pushing, the mass transit and the development along the transit corridor. Mm-hmm. The problem in San Carlos is that there is no public transportation other than on this main corridor. Mm. And people need cars. It's not everybody who can take the train to San Francisco or San Jose to work. And if you think about it, there's just very little ways to get around to do everything else you might do living here without vehicles. And I feel like, that's something that has to be really considered, because like when they built the transit all along the tracks, I think those people got like one parking space, if that,
Are you talking about the residential units?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And, but yet, other than, if you only shopped on Laurel Street, maybe you could get stuff done. But there's no other public transportation. Like, I don't live downtown. There is no bus. There is no way without driving, and it's too far. I could walk down. No way am I walking back. It's too hilly for the majority of people. And I feel like, that's a thing about the way San Carlos is. You can talk about all the people who live down here that can walk or bike or whatever. That's not true for half the town that lives up.
And this is true. There is a significant topography difference in the city as you move from downtown up into the hills. One thing I think I should note as part of this, we never envisioned everyone, or even a majority of people, walking and biking, for example, or taking transit. Even if we could shift 10% or 20% in that direction, that is a huge change in the amount of congestion that you see in streets, the amount of emissions that are out there, et cetera. So again, what we're looking at here as part of this process is understanding that cars are and will be a continued part of the city. Trying to balance that, though, in a multimodal system, right? So that people who are and can take advantage of other modes of transportation feel like they can do so safely. And so if people are saying, gosh, I can't bike right now, I don't feel safe, or there's not enough parking, great, let's have you going there. If people feel like, hey, I'm not able to get there and there's not great, I use a wheelchair and I need accessible parking, we're going to get to that in a second, but that's part of this too. But I understand. We're not banning vehicles. We're not assuming that everyone will bike or walk, for example, or take transit. I think we had another question.
Yeah, so just wanted to see if we could bring this back to the downtown and give some, and do some advising. So I really appreciate the thorough analysis of the parking. It seems like you're setting the stage for what's going to happen in the downtown area, and that's fantastic. And I'm looking at the alleys and on-street parking strategy, and it looks like that's what you're teeing this up for. And I was just wondering, are we going to talk about the circulation that you have proposed right here? And kind of, it seems like there's a lot of really neat opportunities and things to talk about. I didn't know if we're going to get into more detail about that.
So when you refer to circulation, are you talking specifically about like bicycle and vehicle traffic, or
vehicle traffic through the alleys, and then to Wheeler parking, 700 block parking behind Bank of America? It seems like that seems like a really essential kind of circulation for people to get located at the downtown. So Monette, she works at the Reading Bug. She wants to park down there. Where's she going to go, and how does she move through that space? I live up in the hills, and to your point, I'm not, I used to walk down here when I was younger with my young kids. They won't go to the house. I have to drive them. So we'll drive down to Laurel Street, but we have to do the circulation. And what I see is like the Wheeler parking is fantastic. Second floor is available. Signage is kind of funny, and the circulation too. It's a little funny off of Walnut. I can't get to it from Laurel, and it's weird access. That might have something to do with it. And the wayfinding isn't so hot either. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there, and it seems like there's a lot of good minds in here to chime in on that. I was just wondering if that's something we could talk about.
Sure. I mean, we're absolutely happy to take feedback on this. This conversation was really intended to focus on the parking. We're also, as part of this, who is another one of my colleagues who works on this, who's really more the traffic engineer and circulation guy when it comes to that. He's not here tonight. Still, we're happy to take feedback on this, and I think your comments are well put, particularly because they affect parking, right? You were talking specifically about some of these lots. We need really good circulation in and out of these. When you talk about circulation in regards to the parking facilities, is it that there is a lack of information regarding the wayfinding about getting to and from, or literally there's insufficient space, or?
Well, it seems like you're dealing with the number of parking spots, right? You have like your gradation of kind of solutions to that, which is great. I think that's really cool. But I just wanted to, I don't know what it's going to feel like. What has any of us decided on? What is that going to be like? What's that experience going through the alleyways? Yeah. Because I know that was a big concern when this whole thing started. It was like, what are we doing with this really valuable space, these alleys, and how are we going to get through that space? And now I see it here, and that looks, it's a thing that's awesome. It looks like there's angled parking that's happening through the alleyways. It seems like, I don't know, when we circulate through that, I don't remember making comments or having input on what we were doing on the alleyways.
This is an excellent question. We have our urban designer here who's actually more responsible for the design of these things. Because I don't know, Rohit, have we actually had conversations around that?
Scenarios for the circulation. We have existing conditions analyzed, and we have strategies for the future scenarios. But we haven't produced outcomes, but the thought has been given in order to manage the circulation during peak and non-peak hours.
Yeah. So I guess the easy way of saying that's something we need to look at in more detail.
Sure. Yeah. Got it.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a more thorough answer for you. Yes?
What we talked before about pricing is kind of just piggybacking on that. We talked before about like the demand issues within downtown and possibly in the future raising prices. It sounds right now like there's an inefficiency problem in that we have lots of parking in Wheeler, especially at the top, and we're worried about clogging and having to raise prices on parking downtown. I think instead of worrying about because again, your point about pricing not for profit but for demand makes sense, but I also feel like it's kind of inefficient right now in that we have parking available, or we're just not getting people, the flow of traffic to that area. So it sounds like right now we don't need to worry as much about demand, it's more just about efficiency, like we said, getting people to the parking where it is.
Absolutely, and that's really the intent of this. Is there are a lot of empty spaces right now in your downtown. Before we consider pricing and going down that road, let's maximize what you have first to the degree possible, right? Educating people about where the empty spaces are, changing the regulations so that you get employees parking where they need to. There's other things that might not be fully resolved as part of that. So, for example, the RPPs might be necessary to bring in. I don't know. But the idea here is that we're trying to make use of all these empty spaces first, seeing how that addresses the problem, saying, okay, what does our on-street and off-street system look like at that point?
And the other thing I noticed, you talked about the awkwardness of getting to Wheeler, right? Like, if you're going like one direction, like kind of towards San Carlos Ave on, I think that's the 800 block, but there's no entrance to Wheeler on that side, so you have to take a left on San Carlos and then a left back on Walnut. It's just kind of inconvenient. Unless you want to go the other way around. So either way, it's kind of inconvenient. I know now it's not going to, we have parking like on the street kind of next to Blue Line right now. I don't think that's kind of going away, right? So it's just going to be kind of, it's kind of weird to enter on Walnut and having to go around on San Carlos. Just that's probably part of the reason why there's not a lot of parking there. That like people aren't utilizing it because it is. If you park on the first level, you can easily walk to downtown. It's right there. I just feel like people aren't really having a lot of opportunities or understand that that's accessible.
Got it. Yes, sorry.
You go to next door, not that next door is gospel, but you will hear people are aware of all these parking options. They just don't want them. So, I mean, I'm not clear, like, you know, what more you can do to educate people because they don't want to park in Wheeler and walk. Especially when it's dark out at night, they don't want to. They don't want to have to go down the floor and park in the structure. You know, it's kind of a known fact that a lot of people don't like to go into a parking structure and have to go down some floors. They just don't like to do that. That's why the surface streets are so utilized, overutilized. And people don't want to be walking from Caltrain parking lot. It's too far, in their opinion. So next door is a great survey of where people are thinking and feeling about all of this. So, you know, you could educate all you want, but people are familiar that this is available and it's there, but they don't want to use it.
That's good information. I mean, oftentimes we are aware that, particularly like parking structures, things of that sort, parking structures always tend to be your, well, I'll call it your measure of last resort. Everyone who parks wants to park on street first, right? That's like you want to park in front of the store where you go to. Next is your off-street lot. You can still see your car. You want to park in your off-street lot. You're behind the B of A. Great. Last, you go to the parking structure. People generally don't like to get in and out of it. The ingress, egress is more difficult. You have less of a sense of safety, et cetera. Completely understand. What we're trying to do here, and I fully respect the fact that there are probably many people who will say, gosh, I don't want to park there. My question, I guess a question I have is that these strategies that we're trying to get, particularly for Caltrain and Wheeler, for example, are really intended for, these are employee-focused things, not resident-focused. And it might not necessarily even work for all employees. I fully respect the fact that we've worked with different communities at night, for example, people feel like it's not safe walking somewhere, either from a criminal element or just simply for traffic safety. And so we're cognizant of that as well. We're trying to put forward anything we can to kind of shift the dial on this. But I'm curious to see on the next door, are these largely downtown employees who are, okay.
No, they're patrons to the downtown area. And, you know, rightfully so, elderly are chiming in because elderly, you know, don't want to have to either, again, walk that far or that, you know, if it's dark out at night, they don't want to be walking down that way. And so So.
And that makes perfect sense. The idea of what we're trying to do, one of the primary things we're trying to do as part of some of these strategies is get the employees out of the prime spaces to the degree that we can. And it's going to be a bit of a process. We want to try different things to do that. I wouldn't expect many patrons to say, oh, great, I want to go park in the second floor of the Wheeler garage when I can park on street if I'm only going to be there for 2 hours. There's no incentive there. But no, thank you for the comment. It's good to know.
Also, I just want to make a comment talking about circulation, moving around. I mean, it's a great point about how it's hard to access Wheeler Plaza parking. It's also very hard with the way that parking is on the street by that entrance exit of in and out, that one in and out area. And I don't know if the marquee to it is very visible. I mean, that's something to discuss further about, but getting in and out of that garage is very risky in the middle of a block. And so it's problematic, but I also want to talk a bit about Town Restaurant, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on anything, but it's hard to have an in and out on both sides of that small parking lot, and I'm not really sure if it's worthy of trying to make one way in and then one way out. One way in off of Cherry into it, and the out is over on Olive. I don't know, but you know, cars passing each other there. Now we have a huge construction project at one of the entrance exits on Cherry. So I don't know what the solution or answer is for that parking lot for flow, as someone also mentioned here as well, accessibility.
Just to define that a little bit, so you're saying the actual passing movement, there's not enough width there, you feel, to safely accommodate two vehicles?
You've got sometimes pedestrians walking in and out of that area as well, both, you know, across the driveway and through the little drive alleyway there on Cherry in particular. But yeah, it's tough. You know, sometimes you got delivery trucks in and out of there at the same time. So I don't know if it needs to be looked at for one way in and one way out.
Okay, good to know.
There's no pedestrian access. That's one of the problems I hate all the time, is if you park at that end of that big parking lot where town is and whatever, that the entrance and exit is just wide enough for the two cars, and there is no walkway. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to a business, you know, on that end of Laurel Street, you don't want to walk all the way down to the Bank of America or the other end to have pedestrian access. You want to go out that driveway, and there is no pedestrian out space. And so it's dangerous. And now they're doing a big construction project right across the street. So now it's even more hazardous.
It is. I'm not going to go into a whole discussion about it, but parking design has come a long way over the years, because previously, pedestrian access in and out of parking lots wasn't even something to consider. People just walk right through it. A lot of newer parking facilities actually, and we can certainly look at this too, is looking at proper safe pedestrian access in and out of the parking facilities. Near where I live up in Sonoma County, they actually have some good ones I personally like quite a bit. Yes?
Just to clarify, can you explain a little bit more about what this, what you're trying to accomplish with the residential permit parking? Is it to better control the spillover, or is it to create times during the day where patrons and business or employees can park in residential? I guess I don't understand what the point of increasing residential permit parking helps achieve.
Okay, so the residential parking permit, again, would be optional. It's up to a vote of the individual residents in particular areas.
Right.
The primary purpose of it is really to limit employee spillover, right? So, if residents in the downtown here as a collective feel like a lot of employees are parking on their streets and basically taking up spaces all the time, they can get together and say, we want a residential parking permit such that during, I'm going to just make up something, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., if you don't have a residential permit, you only can park here for 2 hours, something along those lines. But it's really about spillover.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the purpose or the enforcement for, say, a residential permit violation is the sheriff's office, the current parking enforcement that you have in San Carlos. Is that correct?
Well, that's why we're recommending shifting the enforcement.
So yeah, and that would just be my comment, because I work in East San Carlos, where we have residential, and there's like East San Carlos Avenue East actually has like business permit parking. But anyways, it's not enforced. It's not enforced. It is actually enforced by the people who live there. I've gotten plenty of Post-its on my car, parking over 2 hours by, I think, people who live there. But in terms of actually getting law enforcement out there to control, and so if you're not doing that, then the residential parking permit program doesn't work because it's not being enforced. So that's why it's, I guess, if that becomes a mid-level strategy, how important enforcement would be in order to make that work.
And that's actually something we heard quite a bit from folks at the GESC, is that there is very minimal enforcement. Again, going back to what I kind of commented on earlier, it's very complaint-driven.
Yeah. No
No one shows up unless you complain, and by that point, it might be too late. So absolutely, enforcement. We've heard that. Yeah. So thank you. Did you have other questions?
Yep.
Okay.
Actually, I just want to add one thing real quick. I think you just touched on it briefly, but the Wheeler Plaza just making more accessible. I think we briefly mentioned it. I think there needs to be like a little more red curve next to the entrance, just so like cars don't park there, so it's like visible both directions. I think there might be trees there which kind of blocks people from like seeing that there's an entrance there. And then also once you get in, there's kind of blind spots, and there's no, like, it's really easy when cars go this way, you don't see it until like the last second because there's walls and stuff. It's kind of the navigation within the garage is also kind of a little rough. Especially
Okay.
on the first level, people are going in and out.
On the first level, you said.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, the bottom level.
Right, yeah, the first level.
Like, when you go in, you want to take a like the visibility is kind of rough. So, and people sometimes go a little faster than they should there, so it's just kind of hard to see.
Okay.
Going in and out of the garage and within the garage, just the visibility of it itself.
Okay, no, that's good to know. We have had conversations with the city about the internal design of the garage to a certain degree. We've heard comments from some folks that the spaces themselves feel very tight, and so we are working with the city right now to compare it to the actual city standards to try to size them appropriately. Okay, let's keep going. Appreciate everyone staying awake during this. All right, zoning and municipal code strategies here. We put this into a separate batch because the other strategies, the short, mid, and long-term strategies, are really more intended to be more operational. These are specific to the zoning code, specific to the municipal code, right? And they vary a bit in terms of how they apply. I should note, we are currently working on a city-wide study to update the city's parking code for the entire city, as well as its TDM ordinance, the Transportation Demand Management Ordinance. This syncs up with that effort. This is the first part of it. As I mentioned earlier, currently there are essentially effectively almost no minimum parking requirements in the downtown because of AB 2097. What we're recommending as part of this, and partly because it's also as part of the MTC TOC policy, in order to remain eligible for One Bay Area grant funding, you have to adopt their policy, which means fully getting rid of any minimum parking requirements in the downtown and adopting parking maximums, which basically puts a cap on the amount of parking that new development can provide. MTC created a system that essentially is tiers for various types of transit stops. So maximums in San Francisco, for example, have to be much lower than those here in San Carlos. We looked, as I said, at development data that the city provided to us for both residential and non-residential development, and are essentially recommended a two-tier system for parking maximums here, such that developments by right can build up to the Tier 1 maximum and can go to the Tier 2 maximum if they provide some sort of public benefit. And public benefit, I mean saying that a portion of their parking, for example, might be publicly accessible. They might pay some sort of fee to the city to improve multimodal access to the downtown, or to the city parts of the city. Going back to the data I kind of mentioned earlier, which I'm sure you all remember, right now market rate units in the city provide about 0.75 spaces per bedroom on average. Office development and R&D provides just over 2.07, I believe what it is. We're setting these maximums up, again, essentially to try to coincide with the MTC TOC policy. However, MTC TOC policy does give us the flexibility to set a cap on a district level as opposed to parcel by parcel, such that we can use the build-out numbers from the general plan to create an overall cap for the downtown, and developments can keep producing parking until they hit that overall cap. It's a bit of a complicated process. We're also talking about this as part of the citywide study, but these are the requirements we more or less need to adhere to in order for the city to maintain its eligibility for grant funding. This is not only being here in San Carlos, this is across the Bay Area, in all, I think, 62 jurisdictions that are affected by the policy. In addition to it, we're also looking at bicycle parking requirements. Currently, the city has parking requirements that are short and long-term bicycle parking, but they're tied to the number of vehicle spaces that are provided, which is a kind of an awkward way to say if you provide fewer vehicle spaces, you don't have to provide as many bicycle spaces. It's a kind of an odd arrangement. And so we are recommending moving away from that and actually having standalone minimum bicycle parking requirements. And having different requirements. I won't go into all the details, the exact numbers here, but not only short and long-term spaces, but spaces for cargo and adaptive bikes, for e-bikes, if you're in a big office building having showers and lockers, for example, understanding that there are many different types of bicycles out there these days that need to be accommodated within bicycle parking. Getting to the question of accessible parking spaces, I think it was in January of this year, the U.S. Department of Transportation officially adopted the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, which essentially requires that if any change is made to a street, you have to bring the street up to code in terms of a minimum number of accessible spaces. So we did a quick inventory of the downtown, looking at the number of accessible spaces that are there currently and how many you would need right now to bring it up to code. And the number looks a little funny down at the bottom because it's a plus-minus issue, but there's roughly about 30 spaces, a little bit more than 30 spaces, more ADA spaces that would need to be provided right now in the downtown to simply bring it up to code. These spaces need to be introduced on what they call a block perimeter. So if you have a 4-sided block, there has to be a certain number of ADA spaces in that area so that they are evenly distributed throughout the downtown. We've obviously mapped where the current ones are right now, but this is something we're very much aware of, that there tends to be a lack of spaces and that these do need to be built in. We're recommending that become essentially part of the city code so that it's automatic when things change. Other zoning code changes. Some of these are a little bit more different. I'll start with probably the most difficult one to kind of grasp. Right now, the way the city code is set up is that it prescribes exactly which streets and on what blocks have certain time limits associated with them. So this street has 2 hour, this street has 3 hour, and it goes for that level of detail. This makes it very burdensome to change any parking regulations because you actually need to go back to the city code and amend the city code in order to make a parking regulation change. What you really need and what really behooves the city to do is to have that authority as part of the Director of Public Works' ability to be able to change regulations if and when needed. So if someone says, gosh, we have a new development coming in and it needs to go from, I don't know, a 1 hour zone to a 2 hour zone or wherever the case happens to be, that they have the ability to do that and make that change when needed. It doesn't necessarily mean they can just eliminate parking altogether and just make everything one big sidewalk. There are going to be limits within it, but it allows the Director of Public Works to be actually able to respond to things as necessary. 2, as part of AB 2097, one thing I did not mention before is that within the law, if a new development comes in and provides any parking, the city by right can require that some or all of that parking be publicly accessible either during some or all hours. Cities can choose to exercise this option or not. Part of what we're looking at, though, in terms of our recommendation, is to say, yes, the city can require that this parking be publicly accessible. Certain uses, it probably wouldn't make very much sense for residential. If you're going to build an apartment complex, making that parking be publicly accessible might be difficult because people have security concerns. If you build a business and an office and that lot is empty at night, it may make sense to actually have those spaces then be publicly accessible. Again, that's part of the flexibility built into the state law. Third, I'm going to kind of skip for a second, is unbundled parking pricing for new developments. Parking pricing, oftentimes, it depends on the situation, is either bundled with the cost or leasing price of a unit or separate. If it's bundled in, you're basically compelled to pay for the parking space whether you use it or not. State legislation was passed last year, I think it's AB 1317, which actually mandates unbundled parking pricing in about half of California. I think they're kind of testing it out to expand it statewide. To essentially require that new residential developments over a certain size, so not single-family homes, not duplexes, for example, separate the price of parking. It doesn't make it more expensive, it doesn't make it less expensive. It just means that you have to pay for it separately from the cost of the unit, such that if I moved into an apartment and it came normally with 2 parking spaces, but I only have 1 car, I only have to pay for 1 space. I don't need to pay for both spaces because it's bundled into the cost. It's a great way, and there's a lot of research to show that this actually reduces vehicle ownership because people actually then have to think about what they're paying for on their parking. The issue, though, and one thing that we're trying to address, is that when you do unbundled parking pricing, it gives you an incentive to try to park on street as a free way to park, right? If I move into an apartment complex and they say I have to pay $250 a month for a spot, but I can get a residential parking permit for $25 a year, I'm absolutely going to take advantage of that. So part of what we're doing here, that's why we also are cognizant about the effects this has on on-street parking demand. In addition, looking at just revised loading standards, relatively basic, and looking at referencing standards for state in terms of electrical vehicles and the ADA parking again. Again, those are more cleanups for the zoning code. I will pause there. Zoning code information can get dense, so yes.
Can you just clarify when we were talking about accessible parking, you had mentioned something about when there's a change.
Yes.
Can you clarify what that means? What do you mean by when there's a change?
That's an excellent question because I said it very ambiguously. No. When a change means is that you're going to make either the city makes a modification to the street in any way, they move a parking space, they do something along those lines, a development comes in, creates a new driveway, does whatever. This activates a change to that street. Now, it doesn't mean that the city can't change spaces before then. It just means that's what the law says, is that the cities are required to do it when that happens, because it can be quite expensive for cities to try to overhaul everything at once. Does that?
Yeah, I guess if say there are no changes, what is the, I guess, motivation for the city to add more accessible spaces outside of obviously seeing that there's a huge deficit there, but is there a chance that the city would actually do it if there were no changes?
So we are actually working with our friends at WRT about designing which spaces and where they should be, particularly where the areas affected by the streetscape master plan. So we really want to focus a lot more accessible parking close to destinations. Not to say that you don't need accessible parking elsewhere, but that tends to be kind of the primary destination for folks. So we are looking at that right now. I apologize, I didn't mention that earlier. There's a requirement associated with it, but we're also looking at it as part of the design. Other thoughts or comments? Okay, all right. Well, we'll keep rolling then. All right. Next up, and this is a final section, so I know we're getting later here, but appreciate your patience. It has to do with transportation demand management. So we're shifting away from the parking a bit, going to TDM. As I mentioned, we're working with another firm right now on a citywide ordinance, both for parking and for TDM. This downtown plan will essentially point to the TDM ordinance, because the TDM ordinance will dictate the law for the entire city. The city currently has a TDM ordinance in place. Transportation demand management, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a suite of programs and mobility options designed to get people to not have single occupancy vehicle trips as much, right? So you offer incentives to take transit. You offer adequate bicycle parking for people to bike. You offer programs to match people with carpooling, et cetera. Maybe people take advantage of it, maybe they don't. But at the end of the day, it reduces vehicle trips and congestion, and it reduces vehicle emissions. The city's current policy that has in place essentially requires most new development to have a vehicle trip reduction of 20%. It's a flat 20% everywhere in the city. It's the same thing. The problem with this, there's a few problems. One is that it doesn't meet the regional policy set by CCAG, the City Council Association of Governments, who oversees the TDM for the region. So it doesn't meet the regional guidelines. It's not necessarily context sensitive either, because it sets the same standard whether you are a residential development building up in the hills or if you're a residential development building next to the train station. It's kind of a uniform standard. There's also no standardized reporting approach that's set to it. TDM, oftentimes, it's really good to maintain it and see how it's working and make sure people are actually implementing it. And there's really not sufficient city resources to monitor it. So again, if you're going to have successful transportation demand management, you need to see how it's functioning over time. Obviously, developers and applicants oftentimes will try to check the box and then never do it again. That's the cheapest and easiest way to do it. So, as part of the ordinance update, we're looking at a few different items. One is aligning the targets with CCAG policy. They range generally from about 25 to 35%. The vast majority of development that's anticipated in the city of San Carlos is within a half a mile of your major transit stops, and the 25% would apply. So you're talking about a slight increase from what is currently required. There would be a whole set of transportation demand management strategies that are defined and allocated points, such that when a development comes in, let's say you're required to get up to 20 points, you have a menu, a suite of strategies to choose from to get you up to that 20 points. Some measures may be required, some might not. And we also want to make sure that we're giving credit to developments that are producing less parking. As we mentioned earlier, parking management is really the best TDM strategy, and these things are very closely aligned. Currently, we've seen quite a few developments come into the city that successfully meet the letter of the law and achieve a 20% TDM reduction, but then overbuild parking, and it's free for everyone. Free abundant parking will almost always trump other modes. It's very hard for other modes to compete with it once you've invested and subsidized so heavily in free parking. And so part of what we're looking at as part of this TDM ordinance is to not allow this to happen, where essentially you say, I met the letter of the law, but basically everyone's going to drive because I provided them parking. But at the end of the day, there's a menu of strategies to choose from. Looking at a standardized template so that every development that comes in provides the same information to the city. It's not, I do it my way, and Rendell does it a different way. It's whatever the case, that's all standardized at the end of the day. And that there's regular monitoring and reporting. Of course, this takes resources too. So part of our work in looking at the citywide study is actually making sure that there is actually funding there to be able to have people in place to keep track of these TDM plans and make sure that they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. This came up as a key talking point at the Planning Commission. They were very interested in maintaining proper monitoring, for example. And ultimately looking at expanding tools, just really user-friendly tools for applicants to know how to go about this program. We don't want to make something that is complicated. That doesn't help anyone. That doesn't help the city staff, and it doesn't help applicants. It doesn't help development. We want something that's relatively simple to use, to the degree possible. There's actually great examples out there of tools that are used by other cities to be able to develop and quickly implement these programs without having to go through a lengthy study first. This process is still ongoing. I will mention, too, the citywide study for both parking and TDM will be at City Council on April 28th, if you'd like to come to that as well. I will pause one last time for comments or questions on the TDM piece. All right. Hearing none, I will turn it back over to Lisa.
Thank you, Brian. I personally think you did a fantastic job going through all of that information. Really appreciate the time you took with our committee to kind of get us through it. And upon a quick scan of the room, I do not see members of the public, so we'll move past that particular agenda item. And just to kind of wrap up our meeting for this evening, I do have a couple of announcements that I would like to share with the DTAC. As you know, we're really wrapping up the Streetscape Master Plan. We're continuing our work on the specific plan, and then we have an implementation project underway. So there's a lot of activity going away in service of kind of realizing the vision for the downtown. So the first thing I'd like to mention is that with respect to the Streetscape Master Plan, that was presented to the Planning and Transportation Commission on April 7th, and they made a recommendation that the City Council adopt it. So that plan, the Streetscape Master Plan, is going forward on Monday, April 28th, where the Council will consider adoption. So if you'd like to attend or tune in or share this information with your neighbors to help celebrate this accomplishment, that would be fantastic. In the meantime, with respect to downtown implementation, the DTAC may recall that the Council is very committed to seeing the Streetscape Master Plan come to life, and so they committed some funds to develop what are called design engineering drawings for the complete span of the 700 block, plus Harrington Park. So several meetings have taken place with the Council where the Council is looking at design components that are being that essentially kind of build on one another to get us to a full design package for this particular segment of the project. So on May 12th, the Council will be looking closely at the design of the pavilion within the 700 block and the water feature. And then on June 9th, we're going to come back to the City Council to really finalize the full design drawings. And the Council can decide if they want to go forward with implementation. We have heard that there is desire to start with Harrington Park. So if that is to happen, the Council would definitely be clear and direct staff to proceed on June the 9th. In the meantime, kind of a follow-up of tonight, you know, we're still working on preparing the policy document, the specific plan for the downtown. And we're looking at June 4th. I don't think we've sent out an email, right, Lynette, because this is all the plans that are unfolding at the moment. But we will be reaching out to the DTAC for your availability on Wednesday, June 4th, where we're going to be bringing back all of the elements of the specific plan, have another meeting with you, and we will be hoping to get your endorsement on those components so that we can continue the writing of the specific plan and then bring that forward for adoption. Other things that are going on related to the conversation that we had this evening relative to parking and transportation demand management. Like Brian said, there is a citywide effort and there will be a study session with the City Council on April 28th. So for those of you that want to hear more, learn more, or you know others that do want to hear more about that, please feel free to share that information. And then before we conclude, and maybe I'll see if you have any other questions before we conclude the meeting this evening, I do want to talk a little bit about schedule for specific plan. So we'll have our next DTAC meeting maybe on June 4th, provided the DTAC is available. And then what would happen after that is in the summer, we would have study sessions with the Planning and Transportation Commission and City Council. So we're looking at the month of June for study sessions with the PTC, Planning and Transportation Commission, and City Council. They will be providing input based upon all of our work that we've done with you here as part of this process, all of the input that we receive from the community on that regulatory document. And then we would make revisions to what we presented and then release a public draft specific plan probably around the end of July. And then we're looking at August 18th to go back to the Planning and Transportation Commission for a formal recommendation, and then to City Council on September 22, where the council could consider adoption of the specific plan. And we'll follow up with the DTAC with all these dates, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of lay out how this process is going to, where we're going to end up, like what is the roadmap for completion. So with that, maybe I'll pause for a moment to see if you have any questions of me about the process. But if not, we can actually wrap up a little bit earlier, which is kind of, we usually take the full 2 hours, but if we are complete, then we can adjourn earlier.
Sorry,
Joaquin.
Really quick question.
Yeah.
So on 700 block, you're ready for construction documents?
That's correct. Well, if the council directs us to proceed on June 9th.
So you guys, okay.
Yeah.
So that's schematic design right there, and design development right there on this page.
That's not the drawing. We do have drawings available on the project website. So if you go to sancarlosdowntownplan.com.
It's that axon shot. Is that the drawing or?
The implementation
Go ahead.
stage is we are developing designs. This is the framework. This
Mhm.
axon is a framework which is now taken ahead to convert that into a detailed design with material specifications, clear dimensions, so more detailing, which could be used as an engineering drawing for implementation.
Got it. Thank you.
So we've never talked about funding. How is the city planning to fund this project? And what's changed?
Funding question, yes. So the specific plan is going to be setting forth some options and strategies for the tools that the city could pursue in terms of gathering funding to really implement this project. As part of the 700 block in Harrington Park, that is up to the city council to determine if they want to go forward and fund this project. And the way that we're looking at it, I mean, funding could happen through community benefit dollars. So as we know, there's a lot of development happening in the east side. Those projects are providing funding in the form of community benefits. So should the council want to use those funds for implementation of the downtown, that would be up to the council. There's also grant funding. There's the One Bay Area grant funding that Brian mentioned as part of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission's transit-oriented communities policy. So we want to set ourselves up to be very successful for future grants, and hopefully we get them. And then funding can come from city sources, the general fund. So there's a number of different ways, and we're going to be talking about that with the council in the near future. Anything else? Great. Well, I appreciate your attention. Thank you for all of the input, and we will be in touch with the DTAC for the next meeting. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.